that there have been infringements on free speech that actually affect not just the British. Of course, what the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is something that we'll talk about today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time. Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there.
When a judge caught Keir Starmer lying under oath, it wasn't just another political incident. It became an event that could fundamentally change the political landscape of the UK. As it turned out, the Prime Minister stood up in court and lied shamelessly about the fate of the Grangemouth refinery, claiming that the government would invest $200 million in the project. But once this came to light, it became clear that not only the promises, but the very fact that these funds had been allocated was a myth, created to justify a political line and appease worried workers. This was no mere caveat or accidental exaggeration. It was a deliberate misrepresentation, a deliberate deception of those who were willing to believe the government's promises. Ideally, government should be a bastion of truth and honesty, but it turned out that Starmer, as Prime Minister, had essentially violated a basic principle of public service: trust. Not just words, but real, vital promises that relate to jobs and economic stability. He did this publicly, assuring workers that their jobs were protected by future public investment. He spoke of $200 million to secure the future of their jobs. The workers, hoping that their problems would be solved, believed his words and could not imagine that this was just a political maneuver to score points with the voters. They went home telling their loved ones that, thanks to the government's intervention, their jobs would be safe. But the truth soon revealed itself. When the government said the money wasn't really there, it came as a real shock. Once in court, Starmer faced the consequences of his lie. The judge who investigated the case did not skirt around the sharp edges. He frankly called Starmer's actions misrepresentation, which has no justification in the legal framework, and it was no longer just a political statement. The judge, whose primary duty is to ensure fairness, issued a formal statement making it clear that promises unsupported by real actions and financial commitments have all the hallmarks of deliberate deception. He questioned the Prime Minister's moral right to be in office, given his irresponsibility and disregard for his obligations to citizens. This was not just an exaggeration in the course of a political fight. It was a complete lack of proper responsibility on the part of the man at the helm of the country. The questions that arose before the judge were not just about political negligence, but whether a man who broke the law in this way could continue to fulfill his duties. However, all of this is just the tip of the iceberg. For if we talk about what political responsibility is, and what exactly it means to be the leader of a nation, Starmer found himself under this pressure in an extremely uncomfortable position. As head of government, he was supposed to be an example of honesty and openness, but it turned out that instead he himself became an example of political hypocrisy. What will happen next? Prime Minister Starmer, who had deceived the working classes, was caught in this terrible political crime, but he did not back down. He did not give a clear explanation for his actions. He didn't try to justify himself, he didn't apologize. Starmer simply remained silent as if it hadn't happened. But silence is worse than lying. When a head of government stands before the court and his actions are openly condemned by the court, and he does nothing to explain or correct his mistake, it once again emphasizes the gravity of the situation. A prime minister who cannot even explain his actions loses not only the trust of the people, but also the trust in the very system he represents. This silence has become a symbol of his failure, a symbol that he is unable to take responsibility for his actions. For when a ruler chooses to break his promises and lie, it means that he has put personal interests and political gain ahead of the welfare of his people. And now that his lies have been exposed, Starmer finds himself at an impasse. He has no excuse. Even his supporters are beginning to realize that their leader has lost control. The Prime Minister, who promised honesty and transparency, finds himself embroiled in a high-profile scandal that could end in his political downfall. Starmer's future political career will likely depend on how he can get out of this situation. However, remaining silent in response to the allegations and the court ruling will likely only hasten his downfall. The trial has shown that the problem is not just with the government's economic decisions, but with the very moral fiber of the Prime Minister. Lying under oath is no longer just a political mistake, it's something much more serious. And when a judge whose job it is to review the facts declares that the Prime Minister has deliberately misled them, it is a signal to the entire political system of the country. This case could be the turning point that will influence the future fate of British politics. When Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister of Great Britain, spoke at the Scottish Labour Conference, his words were to become a landmark moment in his political career. He promised that the government would provide Ps 200 million to save the Grangemouth refinery, promising that this investment would provide jobs for decades to come. He stood in front of thousands of workers on the brink of redundancy and confidently declared that they could rest easy. The government would look after the refinery's future and millions of pounds would be put towards its development. This statement sounded like salvation to the people who had worked for decades on this strategic site and for whom the future of the plant was not just a job but a vital element of their economic and social existence. They trusted him, believed in his words, which seemed sincere, reliable, and most importantly, promised real help in a difficult moment. However, as it soon became clear, this promise was just a dusty illusion, created to appease the voters and attract them to his side at a time when the government was in particular need of support. It was soon revealed that there had been no real investment in Grangemouth. In fact, the promised Ps 200 million was never committed and Starmer had no authority to make such plans happen. This was not an accidental slip, not a mistake, not an exaggeration. It was a deliberate misrepresentation designed to manipulate public opinion and enhance the political image of Starmer, who apparently felt that his promises did not require binding implementation. The very fact that Starmer, as a former director of criminal prosecution services and a lawyer, understood that such promises were unenforceable adds further gravity to his act. He no doubt knew that he could not dispose of such funds as he saw fit. This makes his behavior particularly cynical and irresponsible. He stood in front of workers who were desperate for support and gave them false hope without being able to honor his words. The workers left that meeting confident that their jobs were safe, that the government would support their efforts. They told their families, their children, that their future was secure, that they didn't have to worry, that they didn't have to look for a new job. And perhaps that was one of the cruelest aspects of this whole situation. People believed Starmer's lies and may have already begun to build their lives on those empty promises. But soon the truth came out, and those lies were exposed. Starmer's statement immediately caught the attention of lawyers and the public, and as it turned out, it became the subject of a lawsuit. The judge who presided over the case was unceremonious and unabashedly called the Prime Minister's actions willful misrepresentation. This was not just a political accusation, but a legal assessment of his actions. Starmer was found to have knowingly made false promises, using his status to manipulate public opinion. In the end, the judge concluded unequivocally that the Prime Minister could not be acquitted because not only was he unable to fulfill his words, but he knew it in advance. It was a performance built on empty words, and now the consequences of this lie have become clear. What is stunning about this situation is the complete silence on Starmer's part after the trial. He did not issue a clarification, he did not apologize, he did not attempt to explain his position. He simply remained silent, as if it never happened, as if there was no need to explain himself to the people. He felt he had to take his word for it. This silence probably did not leave the people with a sense of honesty and sincerity on the part of the Prime Minister, but rather it only increased a sense of discontent and frustration. Silence, when one is caught in a lie, becomes a kind of admission that one has no excuse. There were no heated words of defense or attempts to justify oneself. Why justify yourself if you think you can get away with it? This is where the real political drama begins. A prime minister who promised transparency and honesty on his campaign trail suddenly found himself at the center of a scandal that cannot be so easily glossed over. He has been accused under oath of deliberately misleading the public, and no amount of political manipulation can hide that fact. He finds himself in a completely hopeless situation. On the one hand, his silence and refusal to make any comments only strengthened suspicions that his actions were not just a mistake, but a strategic mistake aimed at preserving power at any cost. On the other hand, this scandal proved to be a point of no return for his political career. Politicians who once built their careers on the promises and trust of voters now face the consequences when that trust is betrayed. The fear of losing that trust could spell disaster for a prime minister who finds himself at the center of the most high-profile political scandal of his life. Starmer, who had hoped for popular support, must now face the fact that the loss of that support could be devastating not only to his career but to the entire Labour Party. The judge did not skirt the issue, and his indictment of Starmer was a clear signal. At the end of the day, this is not just a political issue. It is a question of trust, of honesty, and of how political leaders have a duty to be accountable for their words and actions. Starmer could have excused himself, could have apologized, could have tried to correct his mistake. But his silence was the heaviest indictment. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer seemed to continue to build up his political career, But behind the facade of promises and empty declarations was a reality that soon began to erode his position. Already soon after the high-profile Grangemouth scandal, when it became clear that his promises of peace, 200 million to save the plant, were empty, a chain reaction began. Starmer found himself not only at the center of a legal battle, but also the target of growing discontent among his supporters. This scandal exposed him not only as a liar, but also as a politician who was unable to fulfill his basic promises and plan in the best interests of the people. One of the most glaring examples of broken promises was the drastic change in tax policy. Starmer, like many other politicians, had an obligation to take into account the real economic conditions of the country, but instead he chose to use the old political tactic of promising one thing and then doing the exact opposite. In his campaign, he clearly stated, "We will not raise taxes on workers." These words, which seemed to many to be a promise of fairness and concern for people already facing economic hardship, quickly turned out to be a lie. Soon after Starmer became Prime Minister, he did not hesitate to introduce new taxes that directly affected the middle class and the most vulnerable citizens. This treasonous change caused a storm of outrage. For people who believed that this leader would come in and solve their problems, it was a painful blow. Taxes that were supposed to make their lives easier became an additional burden. However, this was not the only violation of campaign pledges. Starmer also promised not to touch pensions and social security benefits, which was an important aspect of his campaign. But after he took office, major cuts and policy changes concerning retirees began. The promise of a steady income and support during cold winters turned into empty words. More than 10 million pensioners lost important benefits that helped them cope with rising prices for energy and other essential goods. The move was a real betrayal, especially for older people who voted for the Labour Party, confident that their rights and support would be protected. As a result, many elderly people were left alone with growing problems, not knowing how to deal with the situation. In addition, growing discontent has been sparked by a dramatic increase in local taxes, which has also failed to match promises. Instead of reducing the tax burden, the Starmer government continued to impose new levies, causing tangible financial hardship for ordinary families. This was another major blow to the credibility of the government and its leader. Workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs began to feel all the promises of support for their working lives crumbling, and instead faced even more pressure in the form of increased taxes and fees. While ordinary citizens became increasingly vulnerable, the government showed no real steps to improve their situation, leaving promises on paper and the reality becoming more and more brutal. Starmer's actions soon led to a real internal crisis in the Labour Party. Although at first glance it seemed that his leadership was still stable, in reality it was only a matter of time. Starmer's ratings were falling and his support amongst the party was beginning to crumble. Former supporters who had once believed in his ability to reform the country and restore hope to the people were now openly expressing their disappointment. People who had stood beside him at campaign rallies were now beginning to publicly question his political commitment. Labour voters who had once been willing to work side by side with him began to wonder if this would lead to their party's downfall. Most of them realized that a political platform built on false promises and populist statements had no future. Starmer found himself at the center of a political storm in which his support within the party and among the electorate melted like snow in the spring. This crisis was not limited to the Labour Party's internal problems. It also signaled to voters across the country that confidence in the old-style government was shattered. Difficult economic conditions, rising prices, and tax increases all caused Starmer to lose touch with those who had elected him. New movements and leaders emerged to try to fill the vacuum left by disillusionment with the current government. Many voters, including those in the most vulnerable segments of society, began to look for alternatives, and the Labour Party was on the verge of a serious political collapse. The difficulties facing Britain under Starmer's rule became apparent. Taxes, unemployment, social security problems all led to the country's economic situation deteriorating. The expectations created by his election promises were not met. None of the growth he talked about happened, but instead the economy continued to stall in the face of high inflation and economic stagnation. All of this begged the questions: what will happen to the UK now? How will the country cope with such challenges if even the government cannot meet its basic obligations? Starmer's internal struggles and falling popularity also affected his own political career. Internal conflicts and contradictions within the party began to escalate, and many of his associates began to discuss the possibility of a change of leader. Starmer found himself in a quandary. His own party had less and less confidence in his ability to handle the situation. The political climate in the country was deteriorating, and citizens felt that no one was listening to them and their problems were going unaddressed. The Prime Minister, who had promised them a future, was not ready for either political responsibility or economic challenges. Thus, the situation for Starmer became increasingly critical. Emotional and political tensions were rising, and the Labour Party was on the verge of its biggest political disaster in decades.